right, we're going to be beginning the service in a few minutes. So let's take this time to center ourselves in the holy and sacred space of the present moment. We will now begin our service. Welcome to Unity of Pasadena. I'm going to use one of Myrtle Fillmore's favorite prayers, one I used last week. It's the Prayer of Faith by Hannah Moore Kohas. And she says this, and by the way, I had this posted up on the Facebook page, so you can follow along with me if you choose. And it'll be there for us to look at during the week. God is my help in every need. God does my every hunger feed. God walks beside me, guides my way through every moment of this day. I now am wise, I now am true, patient, kind, and loving too. All things I am, can do, and be through Christ the truth that is in me. God is my health, I can't be sick. God is my strength, unfailing quick. God is my all, I know no fear, since God and love and truth are here. I love that poem. It's just wonderful to remind us about faith, especially during this time. Our typical opening statement is what I'm going to say, and I'm going to envision some of you knowing it by heart and saying it with me. There is only one presence and one power active in my life and in the universe, God the good omnipotence, and I am one with that presence and power. Well, welcome to Unity of Pasadena. Obviously, I'm not at Unity of Pasadena. I'm in what I call the Englehart studio, which is my house, to be able to bring this broadcast to you and make sure that we can continue in our community experience together through this medium. So we're happy to welcome everyone to Facebook Live. We are so grateful you chose to join us today, and we know that you are not here by accident, but you are here by divine appointment. Unity is a positive path for spiritual living where we teach a positive, practical spirituality. Unity honors the many paths to the one God. All are ways of celebrating the activity of God in our lives. For one God loves all creation equally. And by the way, my name is Reverend Bill Englehart, as I am filling in while Karen Epps is on her sabbatical. She will be back in 2 weeks, so 2 Sundays from today she will be back, and I know we will all be happy to see her and welcome her back into the community. I know many of us have been praying for her and having an excellent sabbatical and for her to come back rejuvenated, and so we look forward to that happening. We are going to have some music today, and the music is going to be by one of my very good friends, Reverend Aaron McCabe, who is a minister in Missouri, also happens to be one of my classmates. And so we're going to hear a song from her right now, and it's called Deliver Me. And I think the first sign says a lot, deliver me from negativity. So let's hear what she has to say.
Give me this day my daily bread. Forgive me all my trespasses, and lead me not into dismay. But let me pray upon the highest hill. Let me know the beauty of thy will. And from it, let me not stray, but deliver me from negativity. Baptize me in your majesty. Christen me with the love that is free. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And I realize that we are one, and only with these eyes do I see. Thy word is heard from mountains high, and valleys low through summer skies, in lands of war and lands where there is peace. Te te makuta ne kadeshama matulena hewa hela wateshputa. From Catholic saints to Hindu names, Buddhist chants and Zen refrains, that's all the paths our feet walk to be free. That's all the paths our feet walk to be free. That's all the paths our feet walk to be free. Baruch atah Adonai, Om Shanti El Shaddai, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya.
I want to thank my friend Erin McCabe for letting us use that song, and we'll be hearing from her again later on in the service today. Just her album, if you like it, is called Believe It. And again, her name is Erin McCabe. So I will now read from the Daily Word for Sunday, March 22nd. And as always, doesn't it seem like the Daily Word was written exactly for us on this day and every day, and today is no exception. The word for the day is power. I take dominion over my thoughts, words, and actions. The power of God protects me. Today I hear with renewed understanding this line from James Dillard Freeman's Prayer for Protection. In a growing awareness of oneness with my source, I realize that the power of God works through me and as me, rather than simply in me or for me. I embody divine power by choosing words that affirm the truth that I am a spiritual being as I navigate the valleys and peaks of my human experience. By expressing my power, I am claiming dominion over my words and thoughts. I affirm statements of truth while releasing negative thoughts and ideas. I think and speak with the authority of my Christ presence. And from 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 7, for God did not give us a spirit of cowardice, but rather a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. Again, the word for the day is power. Now, interestingly enough, that quote from Timothy was something that I'd written down earlier in the week to quote today, and then I pick up the Daily Word, and that exact same quote is there. Once again, the Daily Word is there in ways that I just can't imagine, but I can appreciate. So thank you, Daily Word. Now we're going to have a special guest, and that special guest we're going to hear from is actually Charles Fillmore, and he's going to be reciting the Lord's Prayer. Now, this came from the dedication of the Bridge of Faith, which is an actual bridge at Unity Village. And I believe it was built in the 1930s. And when I was on the Board of Trustees back in 2005, the decision was made to rebuild the Bridge of Faith because it had deteriorated over all those years. And one of the things that we found was that there was a time capsule in one of the pillars in the Bridge of Faith. I believe it was made out of copper. And when they opened it up, there was all kinds of things in there. And there's a recording of the dedication to the Bridge of Faith at that time. And so I happened to get that, and I kept it on my computer for many years, and I feel like today is the day to actually hear from Charles Fillmore at the original dedication of the Bridge of Faith, and we'll also hear a little bit more when we get to later in the service. But here's Charles Fillmore, and it may sound a little bit scratchy because it's an old recording, so it's not your computer, but I would say listen close. It starts off with the bells at Unity Village.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And leave us not in temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
Bet you didn't think you'd be hearing from Charles Fillmore this morning. I'm glad to hear his voice and glad to hear the bells at Unity Village and that organ music in the background. What a beautiful way to honor one of our co-founders. One of my teachers when I was going through the seminary was on the licensing and ordination team for me to decide whether or not I should become a Unity minister. Her name is Nancy Norman, and she put together a CD many years ago, and it's so good to this day. I listen to it, and it's a 12 Powers meditation. And so today we're going to hear her voice and leading us into a meditation, and it's going to be on the power of faith. And again, this is Nancy, the Reverend Nancy Norman.
I now direct my center of attention to the middle of my head, the center of faith. I ask that the power of faith be quickened within me. I ask that the power of faith be quickened within me right now. I have faith in God, and I know that nothing is impossible to me. My faith brings my good to me from the invisible into the visible realm of being. How grateful I am for this knowledge. Faith is a power that links my present with my future. With faith, I am on solid ground. With faith, I have a deep inner knowing that all is well in my world. Faith is a magnetic power that draws to me my heart's desire. It brings results to me that are seemingly miraculous. I am one with perfect faith. I am one with perfect faith. My faith is sufficient for all things and equal to all occasions.
Thank you, Nancy Norman. Let us take a few moments to prepare ourselves now, if we haven't already, to a time of inner reflection and meditation. As we heard those wonderful words of faith, the prayer of faith, knowing that the Spirit of God is within each and every one of us, let us take a few cleansing breaths. Surely we've all spent time in prayer over the last week or so. Let us spend a few minutes now in the silence, listening to hear what Spirit has in store for us. And so it is. As we come out of this time of silence, it feels good to experience the silence, especially nowadays when we can be tied into the news and the radio, and it can just be overwhelming. And it's hard to take it all in. So I believe spending time in the silence each day, and I find it really helpful to be reading the daily word, and I've got a couple other daily devotionals to start the day off, to read, to then go into the place of meditation, to go into the place of silence, to ground myself has always been important. But I believe it's never been as important as it is right now for all of us to have that place of refuge, and to know that place of inner refuge is always available to us, no matter what is going on in the outer. You've heard me say it before, and I'm sure you've heard Reverend Karen say it as well, that our true peace is not determined by what's going on outside of us. Rather, it's what's going on inside of us. So there's plenty of opportunities for us to call on that silence and to be rejuvenated by it, and then be able to go out and meet the day as we may need to go to the doctor or may need to go to the grocery store, or to be able to just step outside on our balcony and be able to let the fresh air come in. So there's a blessing that we can draw upon by being present to what is and always being able to call upon the silence. So now we're going to hear another song from Reverend Aaron McCabe, and this one's called Wake the Sleeping Prophet.
Wake up, Jeremiah. Hosea, what did you say? I hear the voice of Daniel ringing true today. Wake the sleeping prophet, bring it to today. Through the ashes of the ages, we all stop and pray. Let's build an inner temple, make an outer one of clay. A war horse cannot ramble, and great might cannot save. Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. It's not about what's going on, it's about how we play. And we're still living the same old lives from years ago today. The kings, they haven't changed much, judges still in dismay. It's not about left or right, it's about a better way. It's funny, but it's serious, because we have to change our mind. The purpose of religion is not to make us blind. Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up. There's no need for tempests or complicated refrains. The heart is the greatest compass, the temple that paves the way. In the struggle for freedom, the only weapon that we possess is in the mind of a loving heart, a truth called nobleness. So wake up, Jeremiah. Hosea, what did you say? A war horse cannot ramble, and great might cannot save. Wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up, wake up.
Yeah, I just love that music. I love Erin. She has such a great message, and I'm glad to be able to share her message with you today. As I start off today's talk, I want to point out a couple of things. One, being from the Midwest, often even the same thing happens pretty much wherever I go, but I noticed it a lot in the Midwest. There'd be times that there'd be thunderstorms or tornadoes or other natural events, and people would lose their electricity. It happened to me on many occasions. But all the time that I would hear that report, no one would say the electricity is out. They would say 10,000 people are without power. And now that really annoyed me, because we are never, ever without power. There are times we may be without electricity. I totally get that. But that's totally different from saying 10,000 people have no power. I never bought into that, and I hope you join me in never buying into that as well, because we all have the power within us, and no one can ever take that away. Now, why am I talking about that today? Because I believe something similar is going on right now, because the term that keeps being used and bandied about, whether on all kinds of media, is social distancing. Well, actually, this is not about social distancing. This is about physical distancing. It's about staying 6 feet away from each other. Social distancing would mean that you and I couldn't be online right here, right now, or having any kind of interactions, or talking to people on the phone, or writing letters, and that's not the case. So I believe words are important. And during this time, we have physical distancing, but I don't buy into the idea of social distancing, because that is something we can certainly do over the phone, through email, through Facebook Live, through many other mediums. So that's my rant about words. One thing I also want us to realize, which oftentimes we don't, is that when we're faced with a crisis, when we're faced with a challenge like we are all facing right now, there's a tendency to think this is going to last forever, that this is how it's going to be. And I want to assure all of us that this will pass. The time will come when this will pass, this situation and circumstance. So if you find yourself, and I know I found myself at times as well, thinking, how am I going to live the rest of my life like this? Then I catch myself and say, it's not the rest of my life. It's right now. It's something that needs to be done, but this too will pass. Now, when I think of this as far as a situation and a circumstance, it reminds me of the book that was written by another one of my teachers, one of my favorite teachers, Robert Brummett. And the title of his book was called Finding Yourself in Transition. Let me show you the book. Oh yeah, it's a church. I can't show you the book, but you can look it up, Finding Yourself in Transition. It's a book I recommend everyone has in their library. I've found myself in transition many times, and whenever that comes up, what I like to do is refer back to it. When we go through a transition, it can feel like a death, but then it can also feel very much like a rebirth as we move through this process of transition. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to share some biblical and personal experiences that relate to this idea of finding ourselves in transition, that follows along with the ideas that Robert Brummett put into this book, Finding Yourself in Transition. So what happens, what's the first thing to happen when there is a transition? The first and foremost thing that happens is that there's always an ending. Something ends. For the Hebrew people back in the Bible, that their ending was the departure from Egypt. They prayed for deliverance. They were in bondage, and Moses came along. God was with them and took them from Egypt. They prayed for that deliverance. They were released from bondage. I believe right now, for most of us, in the short term, it feels like life as we know it has ended. And in the short term, it has. But again, it is the short term. We've all had other kinds of endings, whether it's a loss of a job or a divorce or having to move, a person close to us has died. There's all kinds of endings that we've been through. Now, what happens after the shock of the ending has occurred is what's called disengagement. Now, I'm sure the Hebrew people, as we look at the wilderness journey, were asking themselves, well, who am I now? And what do I do now? Because they had their life, even though it was in bondage, they knew what it is that they were going to be doing every day. They knew what their roles were in that society. Then all of a sudden, when they leave that, they leave the city, they end up going out into the wilderness, that question comes up, well, who am I now? Maybe it's who am I now because of a divorce, or who am I now because the the job that I had has gone away. Who am I and what do I do now? So we may be in that place right now, wondering, well, who am I right now and what am I going to do right now? I remember specifically having this feeling when I worked at a corporation back in Kansas City, and there were all kinds of layoffs going on, and I was the person that had to deliver that news. And I went in and talked to my boss and said, well, when these layoffs are done, why don't you make me the last person to get laid off, because my skills were in recruiting and I needed to go to a company that was expanding versus contracting. And so here I had actually called on that transition, to call on an ending, and then there was this feeling of disengagement that happened, and I can tell you exactly what that felt like and when it was. What happened was that I left that job, and I'd been there 7 years, and remember being in my car, and I'm driving home, and I saw a man walking down the street with a briefcase. And all of a sudden, I said, I don't have a job to go to on Monday. And this just came flooding through. Who am I now? What do I do now? And I know I'd be out looking for another job, etc. But I got to tell you, that feeling just hit me like a freight train. Life was no longer in familiar territory. Remember, right after I got divorced, and I was living alone, and I was no longer, it didn't have anybody living with me. Obviously, at that point in time, I was divorced, and it was very discombobulating. I was wondering, well, okay, now, who am I now? I'm not in this relationship anymore. It was very confusing, very disengaging. Who am I? What do I do now? I remember hearing a story on National Public Radio many years ago about men that got laid off from a manufacturing plant. And, they put chain link fences around plants that are closed. And some of the men who used to work there would meet up at that front gate with the chain link fence. They'd bring their lunchbox with them, and they would sit there and they'd have lunch together. And they had just been in this place, I'm sure, of wondering, after so many years, going to that factory, going and having that job, and now there's this ending, and they're asking themselves the question, who am I now? What do I do now? And I'm sure it was somewhat comforting to be with some of their friends, but it's at that point of having a hard time of saying what's happening next. Now, when the Hebrew people went out into the wilderness and Moses went up the mountain to get the 10 Commandments, what he ended up doing was disengaging from the tribe, because he went up Mount Sinai alone. And so for us, we may feel like we're on that process right now where we've been forced out of our typical tribe because we can't meet in person, and that we are alone. It's an external process that this displays for Moses. And for us right now, that process feels external, and that I can't go to work, I can't go to Starbucks, I can't visit my friends or family members in the hospital, that we can't go to a nursing home to spend time with a parent or a grandparent. We can't spend time socializing with each other in person. So there's a lot of externalness to this process, feeling disengaged and feeling rather alone during this time. Then there's the disidentification level, and that's our sense identity, which is much more of an internal process. I remember when I left the corporate world, and I'd been an international human resources director for a Fortune 50 company, and when I had left that, and I left it on purpose, because I felt I'd done everything I needed to do in that career, and so I was waiting to see what would come for me next. And so I was doing black and white photography, and I had some photography shows at some galleries, and that was very exciting. But people would come up to me, and they would introduce themselves, and in America, what do? We say, well, what do you do? And even though I thought for sure I had not fallen into the trap of being so identified with my job, because I worked in human resources and I saw how people come and go, that's just the nature of how corporate world is, I told myself, never get too attached, because the day is going to come when either you're going to get laid off, or you're going to retire, or you're going to decide to do something else, And when that happens, you don't want to be identified so much with that role. And so I pat myself on the back, felt like I'd done a really good job. And then here it was, I'm home from Europe, and 2 weeks later, people start asking me, what do you do? And the first thing I would say is, well, I used to be an international human resources director for a Fortune 50 company, but now I do black and white artistic photography. And it took, I don't know how many months before it dawned on me how identified I was with that old role, and that I started to really realize, well, I'm not that role anymore. And so this is part of an internal process, a sense identity, that I was not that person anymore, and I needed not to keep saying what I was, so I can start to figure out who I am right now. So I remember, as growing up, I was the only sibling that had not gone through a divorce at a certain period of time, and I gotta admit I felt pretty smug about that, because I had a couple other sisters that had gone through divorces, and I felt like, oh, well, I know how to do relationship, right? And of course, when you feel like that, there came the time when that was no longer the case, that I ended up going through a divorce, and I didn't know anything more about relationship either. And again, this sense identity that, oh, I really had some things figured out, really got smashed up on the rocks like a boat on rocks on the shore. But sometimes the desire to maintain a former identity can be so strong that we feel like we'd rather die than let it go. I knew that I had that attachment unknowingly to that old job title of being the international HR director, that it just felt horrible to feel like I could let that go. And when I say feel like rather die, I mean, it felt like there was something dying in me, was that attachment to that old job title and that old life that I'd had. Now, during this time, grieving was needed versus glomming onto another external mirror. So grieving what was is an important thing, and I feel it's totally important for our own mental, physical, and spiritual health. When something ends, that we allow it to grieve, we allow ourselves to grieve, so that we can actually work our way through it. If we deny it, it's not going away. It's just laying there below the surface, and sooner or later that's going to come out, and it'll be in an unhealthy way. So it's better to feel what it is that we are feeling, to be able to work through it, because as my professor Robert Brummett said, you can't heal what you are not willing to feel. And so there's a losing of one life, but then there's the rebirth of another. In fact, in the book of Matthew, it says it like this, chapter 16, verse 25. Whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And so when we let go of what was, let go of those old masks, let go of those personas that we thought it was who we were, that we start to really discover who we are. There's a term called enchantment. And what does enchantment mean? It means living under a spell. Now, we all have been under different enchantments in our life. There's a cultural paradigm that we're brought up with. There are collective beliefs. One of those collective beliefs is always, well, material success equals happiness. Now, that's just one of many of those things that we're going to be judged just on our worth is on how we look. I mean, there's all kinds of cultural paradigms and beliefs that we're giving that aren't true. I know plenty of people have a lot of money that are not happy. I know that there's plenty of enchantments I've fallen under. And when we realize that that's not true, then it's a point in time of disenchantment, where we realize that our career or money or title or a certain relationship or a certain address was going to lead to happiness. And we may get to that point where we find out that none of those things have really led us to true happiness. In fact, Tolstoy, when he was going through something very similar, and it says this about him. About the age of 50, Tolstoy relates that he began to have moments of perplexity, of what he calls arrest, as if he knew not how to live or what to do. Life had been enchanting, and it was now flat, sober, more sober than dead. Things were meaningless, whose meaning had always been self-evident. The questions why and what's next began to beset him more and more frequently. These questions, why, wherefore, what for, he felt there was no response. So he said this, I felt, said Tolstoy, that something had broken within me, on which my life had always rested, that I had nothing left to hold on to, and that morally my life had stopped. All this took place when, so far as all my outer circumstances went, I ought to have been completely happy. I had a good wife, good children, a large property, and yet I could give no reasonable meaning to any actions of my life. You see, his old life was coming to an end, and a new life would ultimately emerge, and disenchantment was the first sign. Of course, we know Tolstoy is a famous author. So what happens after this disenchantment? Then there can be a time of disorientation, to be confused, not knowing which direction to turn. And that happens when we realize those old road maps, those old cultural paradigms no longer work. The continuity of life feels broken. The ego gets separated from who it is and has been. And what's the result of this? The result is a dismantling of the old self, life, and reality. But once we get to that point, we realize it's a necessary step for transformation. We get to that point of being disoriented. My old road maps don't work anymore. What am I going to do now? I have to be open to a new way of living, of being, of where am I putting my faith? And so how does this play out in the story of the Hebrew people after they left Egypt? Well, they went into the next stage, which is called the void. And it's in that void where they have the opportunity to face their fears. Now that is manifested by them wandering in the wilderness. And I know for many of us right now, we may feel like we are definitely wandering in the wilderness, wondering how long is it going to take to get to the promised land, and what is it that I'm going to do during this time? Well, the Hebrew people, the word they used back then for complaining was murmuring. And so the murmuring had begun. They, after all the miracles and everything that God brought them out of Egypt, out of bondage, that they still were murmuring. They were like, well, at least back in Egypt, I knew what I was going to eat, even though I was in bondage. So the murmuring begins, the complaining begins. Moses starts hearing all these things. At one point, they say, well, we don't have any meat. And so everybody's upset about that. And then Moses and God works that out, where birds come down from the sky and they're able to collect them up and they have meat. Then it's we don't have enough water. And then Moses helps them with that. And then when he goes up to Mount Sinai, then there's the idol worship. And there's all kinds of things that go on when we're in the wilderness journey. We're afraid. There's fears that need to be faced. And there's this collective unrest. And we can look at it this way, just like the Hebrew people, where they wanted change. Of course, they no longer wanted to be in bondage to the Egyptians. They wanted change, but they didn't want disruption. I want change, but I don't want things to change too much. I want change so I can be delivered, but I don't want any disruption. I want deliverance, but I don't want to actually have to move. See, they were in bondage, but again, during that bondage, they had food, shelter, and predictability. But when we are going through a time of transformation, we need to move from one state of consciousness to another. And when we do that, there can be the tendency to look backwards and say, well, I wish I had this. It's like, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to over the years, and I'm sure I've been one of those at certain times, that say, I really hate my job. I don't want to be doing that work anymore. And then when you get fired or laid off, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I wish I had that job back. And then it's like, wait a minute, that's what I wanted to get away from. And so now what's happening is that there's change happening, but any kind of deliverance, and maybe deliverance from our old thought forms and habit patterns, our ideas of lack and limitation. That deliverance is a double-edged sword. That we want something new, but that means we have to leave something behind. Again, I hated the job, but once I let go, there's the fear of change and wanting it back. Maybe there was the desire to have a divorce, but then there's the fear of change and saying maybe I should go back even though it wasn't fulfilling for either person. That there's a desire to return to an unhappy situation because it's known. But when we're on this path, and again, this spiritual path, those kind of things may come up where we always want to go backward, but we are being thrust forward into a place of creation. And where does creation begin? When we're in the void, it's in a place of emptiness. And once we're able to reside in that place, and at a certain level of unknowingness, I don't know exactly how things are going to work out, but I have faith that it will. I have faith that things are not going to remain the same as they are right now. So once we move through that void, then that's the place where we get to be in new beginnings. And a new beginning in this story of the Hebrew people is about going into the promised land. See, we've completed the work of the endings, we've gone through those stages, we've gone through the void, and then we are ready to inhabit the promised land. Now, metaphysically is how we interpret the Bible and in unity, and that's every person, place, and thing in these stories can and does relate to what goes on in our own consciousness, that the Hebrew people represent our thoughts. Now, what had to happen for the Hebrew people to take possession and to move into the promised land was they had to get rid of their old thought forms and habit patterns. Even though they were no longer in bondage in Egypt, they still carried that bondage, lack, and limitation consciousness with them. And so how this gets worked out metaphysically is that generation that was delivered from Egypt had to all die off. So all their children, which represent the new thoughts and that are not born in lack and limitation, that their new thoughts are the ones that replace the old thoughts, and they can enter into the promised land. Because if we continue to be in a thought of lack and limitation, of bondage, you can't possess the promised land. So metaphysically, when the old generation dies off, the new generation is born, it's all about changing consciousness. So during this time, for each and every one of us, I would ask us a question. What's truly important during this time? What is truly important? What can I truly rely upon? Because when this time comes to an end, and it most certainly will, we have an opportunity to be changed, to be able to move forward with a different consciousness. Maybe we will have different priorities. Maybe we won't be looking at each other with such disdain, whether it's left politics or right politics, that we will look at each other as children of God first, and to be able to hold that consciousness. So this is a time for us. It's been a time that's been imposed upon us, but it's a time where we can take this time, we can do our meditation, we can do our prayer, we can read spiritual things that are uplifting. We can look at what's important to us and what am I going to do when this time passes. There was a time I was hospitalized many years ago, and I remember lying in the hospital bed, and I made out a list that when I get better, because I claimed it, even though everything looked like it wasn't, I wrote out a list of things that I was going to do. And that when I got better, I kept that list and I worked it until all of those things were done. So this is an opportunity for us all to do internal work, to discover our deep desires. It's time for new commitments. It's time for an inner reflection. If we follow this path, truly we will find ourselves in transition. In fact, I'd read that book many times, and the title, Finding Yourself in Transition, I always took literally, just finding yourself in transition. Yes, I'm in transition. And then all of a sudden it occurred to me, no, this is about finding myself during times of transition. And I encourage all of us to take this as an opportunity to do just that. I'm going to say our affirmation, and then you can say it along with me online. The affirmation is, I can find my true self in times of transition. Together, I can find my true self in times of transition. Well, we've gotten to this point. I really appreciate each and every one of you tuning in, and I would ask right now, we are going to do a blessing of the offering, but how are we going to take up the offering through this technology? Well, there is a donate button on the Unity of Pasadena website, not the Unity of Pasadena Facebook page. So if you go to the Unity of Pasadena website, I encourage you to go there and to donate through that medium and that portal, because Unity of Pasadena needs those funds. It's our community. We are the community. And especially during this time, to make sure we keep things going is very important. So again, that donate button is on the Unity of Pasadena website. And I'm going to say our offering blessing. God is the source of my overflowing supply, and I am grateful. Again, God is the source of my overflowing supply, and I am grateful. By the way, if we have anyone new that's tuning in to Unity of Pasadena for the first time, we'd like to send you a welcome packet, and all you have to do is send an email to admin, ADMIN, at unityofpasadena.org. And we know wherever you are on your journey of faith, you are welcome here, whether it's on our online community or whether it's in person when that happens again. I'm going to say our Unity blessing. We love you, we bless you, we appreciate you, and we behold the Christ in you. Now it's time for the prayer for protection, and then I'm going to have some recessional music that's going to play at the end of that, and that's again from the Unity Bridge of Faith dedication back in the 1930s. And I also want to say right now, it's been quite the experience for me utilizing this technology, and happy to use it, and I'm sure we'll get better and better at it as time goes on. But it also reminds me that Charles Fillmore in 1924 was the first radio presentation by a clergyman in the United States. 1924. So we're in a long line of utilizing technology, and so we're going to utilize this to be able to continue to get the word out and to continue to remind ourselves that we are not alone, that we are in this together. This time will pass, and as we come through it, I see that we will have grown spiritually, each and every one of us. So I invite you to join me in the prayer for protection. The light of God surrounds us. The love of God enfolds us. The power of God protects us. The presence of God watches over us. Wherever we are, God is, and all is well. And so it is. As we hear this recessional music, I want to thank you for tuning in to Unity of Pasadena, and we will be back online next Sunday, 10:30, the same time, same place. Blessings to you. Thank you all for tuning in. Blessings to you.